Have you ever wondered what you would do if one day everything you loved was gone? If the people you held most dear, your family, your home, your faith in the world, vanished like dust in the Montana wind? Would you still have the courage to begin again in a land where the horizon never ends and hope feels too far to reach? This is the story of Ethan Cole, a frontier widower who swore he'd never love again until the day Clara Bennett, a mail-order bride from Boston, stepped off the train at Silver Creek with nothing but 17 cents, an old suitcase, and a tear in her eye. From that single moment, two broken lives began to heal, not through grand gestures, but through small mercies, a shared meal, a mended fence, a light kept burning on a long winter night. It's a story about second chances, about how love doesn't just fill the silence after loss, it teaches us how to live again. And maybe, as you listen to their journey, you'll find yourself wondering, what if the biggest mistake of your life turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to you? If you believe in stories that heal, stories about kindness, hope, and love that grows where no one expects it, then please like, share, and subscribe to join me for Frontier Hearts, the story of Ethan and Clara Cole. Because sometimes the softest tales are the ones that stay with us the longest. Silver Creek lay under the color of ash and rust that October fields dulled to brown, fences grayed from wind, and a quiet that came only when summer had truly gone. The mountains beyond looked close enough to touch, though Ethan Cole had stopped reaching for things a long time ago. Most mornings, he saddled up before dawn, rode the northern fence, checked the stock, and returned to the same silence that waited in his house. The porch boards still creaked the way they had when Anna used to come out with a shawl around her shoulders, calling his name through the cold. That sound lived somewhere inside him now, sharp, small, and unhealed. People in town said Ethan Cole had buried more than his wife and boy out there on the ridge. They said he'd buried the man he used to be. Martha Harper, his sister down in Billings, had written him twice that year. He hadn't opened either letter. One of them, though, had opened its way into the newspaper, the Bozeman Gazette. Column 3, bottom left, it read, "Widower, 36, of sound health and steady income, seeks virtuous lady for companionship and marriage. Correspondence to be directed to Cole Ranch, Silver Creek Territory." He didn't know about that until the afternoon the train came through. The noon freight didn't usually stop in Silver Creek. There wasn't much reason to, but that day it slowed to a hiss, and the conductor shouted something about a passenger drop-off. Ethan had been in town for feed 6 sacks of grain and a spool of fence wire when he saw her. She stepped down from the second car, a small figure in a faded blue traveling coat, clutching a valise that had seen too many hands. Her hat was too fine for this country. It sat a little crooked, pinned over hair that might once have been gold. The wind caught the edge of her skirt, lifting the dust around her boots. She stood there motionless, like someone waiting for the ground to remember her name. "Miss Bennett," the conductor called. "Silver Creek stop." She nodded, but her voice didn't come. Ethan hadn't meant to stare, but something in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't fear, exactly. Not just fear. There was pride there, too thin, trembling, but real, like a flame refusing to die. He wasn't a man to meddle, yet he found himself walking closer. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat. "You lost." Her answer came soft, clipped by the wind. I was told this is where Mr. Ethan Cole lives." He stiffened. "So I received a letter," she said, "from his sister, Mrs. Harper." She pulled out an envelope, edges worn from travel. She said, her voice faltered. She said Mr. Cole was seeking a wife. The grain sacks thudded to the ground beside his boots. For a moment, he didn't speak, didn't even breathe. Then, slowly, he took off his hat, ran a hand through hair that had gone gray too early. "I'm Ethan Cole," he said finally, "but there's been a mistake." Clara Bennett had traveled 2 weeks from Boston with 17 cents to her name and one old valise that carried a Sunday dress, a Bible, and a photograph of her mother. She had no family left there, no prospects, no place that wanted her name. The letter from Mrs. Harper had come like a door half opened. She'd stepped through because there was nowhere else to go. Now she stood in front of the man himself, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, eyes the color of river stones, and felt something inside her fold. Not because he was unkind, but because he looked so certain that kindness had no place left in him. "I can see that you didn't know," she said quietly. "Your sister wrote on your behalf. I shouldn't have come." Ethan wanted to agree. He wanted to say, "Yes, you shouldn't have." But the words stayed. The train behind her hissed like it was laughing at both of them. "You've come a long way," he said finally. "Nearest lodgings 6 miles east, and the wind's turning cold. You'd best stay the night. There's a spare room." Her chin lifted at that. "Just the night," she said. He nodded, but as he loaded her valise into the wagon, he caught sight of the tear she was fighting, just one, bright in the corner of her eye, before she blinked it away. And for some reason he couldn't name, that was the moment everything shifted. The road home wound along the creek, through willows stripped bare. The sky leaned low and gray. Neither spoke much. Clara held her hands tight in her lap, the gloves thin enough that her fingers trembled. Ethan tried not to notice, but when he handed her a blanket from behind the seat, she accepted it with a small, "Thank you." "Mr. Cole." "Ethan," he said. She looked at him, unsure if that was permission or correction. "Ethan," she repeated softly, and turned her gaze back to the hills. He caught himself wondering what kind of woman left Boston for a stranger in Montana. Maybe the kind who had nothing left to lose. Maybe the kind who still hoped to be needed. When they reached the ranch, the dogs barked, circling the wagon wheels. The house stood low and plain, logs weathered to silver. A curtain fluttered in the upstairs window, one that hadn't moved in years. He noticed that, and it unsettled him. "I'll heat some stew," he said as he lifted her valise. Firewoods stacked by the stove. Rooms down the hall to the right. She followed him in silence, eyes catching on the worn furniture, the framed photograph on the mantel, Anna and Daniel, frozen forever in a sunlight long gone. Clara didn't ask who they were. She just touched the frame gently, as if greeting them. Later that night, the wind rose against the windows. Ethan sat at the table, staring into the fire, listening to the sound of a stranger moving softly in the next room. He told himself it was only for one night. He'd put her back on the train tomorrow. But when he stepped outside to bring in the lantern, he saw her shadow by the kitchen, small, bent over the stove. She'd cleaned the counter, scrubbed the pan, set out 2 bowls of stew. The house smelled of rosemary and smoke. She looked up when he entered, startled. "I hope you don't mind," she said. I couldn't sleep. He shook his head. No harm done. They ate mostly in silence. She asked once about the hills beyond the pasture. He told her that's where the first snow always fell. Then she smiled a small, quiet thing that reached only halfway. But it changed the room. It made it feel less like a place for ghosts. When she went to her room, he sat a long while longer. The wind pressed against the walls, steady and soft, like it was trying to remind him of something. I remember thinking, she won't last here. She's too slight, too kind for this land. But I was wrong. What I didn't know then was that the woman who stepped off that train with one tear in her eye wasn't looking for rescue. She was bringing it with her hands, her patience, and the quiet courage that fills the space grief leaves behind. Morning came with a frost that clung to the window panes like breath that refused to fade. The world outside the ranch house was silent so still that even the horses seemed reluctant to move. Inside, Ethan Cole stirred the ashes in the stove until they glowed red again. He wasn't used to another soul in his house. Every sound, the clink of dishes, the soft scrape of boots on wood felt foreign, like echoes of a life he'd already buried. Clara Bennett had been awake since before dawn. He found her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, hair pinned loosely back. The smell of biscuits and coffee, real coffee, not the burnt sludge he'd been making for years, hung in the air. She didn't turn when he entered, just said quietly, "I hope you don't mind. Mr. Cole, I thought breakfast might be better than silence." He meant to tell her she didn't need to trouble herself. Instead, he stood there, watching the way her hands moved small, careful motions that spoke of habit and worry. "It's Ethan," he said at last. "Mr. Cole sounds like someone else." A faint smile crossed her face, but she didn't look up. "Ethan." Then, they ate in near silence. Outside, the frost melted into thin mist. Inside, the stove popped and cracked, filling the gaps where words might have gone. Ethan couldn't remember the last time the table had 2 plates on it. Later that morning, he found her outside sweeping the porch with a broken broom. The boards had warped over the years, and dust clung to everything like memory. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I know," she answered simply, "but it looks less lonely this way." He didn't argue. Some things didn't need correcting. By afternoon, she had washed the curtains and mended a tear in one of his shirts. When he tried to stop her, she said only, "It helps to keep busy." He understood that. Sometimes work was the only thing that kept grief from spilling out. That night, a wind came down from the hills, rattling the shutters. He heard her pacing in the small room down the hall. Finally, he knocked. "You all right, Miss Bennett?" A pause, then her voice, thin through the door. "Just couldn't sleep. Old habit." He hesitated, then stepped inside. The lamp was low. She was sitting by the window, arms around herself. The sleeve of her dress had slipped down, and for a moment he saw the bruise along her shoulder dark, deliberate. She noticed his gaze and pulled the fabric up. "Who did that?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "No one that matters anymore," but he'd seen that kind of mark before. The kind a man leaves when he thinks he owns something fragile. He fetched the tin of liniment from the shelf and set it on the table. "Hold still," he said. She tried to protest, but he dipped a cloth in the oil and began to dab gently. His hands were rough, scarred from years of fence work, yet he touched her as though afraid she might break. "It'll sting," he murmured. "I've known worse," she replied. Their eyes met then, for the first time without armor. Something unspoken passed between them. Not comfort, not pity, but recognition. Two people who had both lost more than they could say. Later, as she buttoned her sleeve again, he said almost to himself, "My wife used to keep that same bottle on the shelf, said it could cure anything but heartache." Clara looked up. "She sounds kind." "She was," he said softly. "Anna, she and our boy, Daniel, got the fever one winter. I buried them under the cottonwood hill." His voice was steady, but each word felt like gravel in his throat. "Since then, I just kept working. It's easier to mend fences than to think." "I understand," she said. He almost laughed. "You can't." "I can," she insisted. "Loss doesn't care where you come from. It leaves the same emptiness." He didn't answer. But as he looked at her, this woman from Boston, with a borrowed name and eyes too brave for her own good, he wondered how long it had been since someone had dared to speak to him that way. The second day, she cleaned the parlor. No one had stepped foot there since Anna's funeral. Dust lay thick over the piano. Clara didn't play her fingers, only brushed the keys once. Softly, but she polished every surface until the air smelled of lemon and soap. He came in from the barn at dusk and found the room glowing with lamplight. She'd set a vase of dried wildflowers on the table. "You shouldn't have done this," he said quietly. "I know," she replied, "but it looked like the kind of room waiting for someone to breathe in it again." He didn't speak for a long time. Then, with a slow breath, he said, "You can stay another night if you'd like. The train won't run again till Thursday." 3 days. Then, she said, 3 days. The third morning broke warm, the sun soft over the ridge. Ethan saddled his horse early, meaning to ride the east fence. She followed him to the porch, hands folded in her apron. "Will you be long?" she asked. He almost said yes, but the question felt strange, like something a wife might ask, years ago. "Not long," he said instead. "You'll see me before sundown." He did return before sundown, though part of him wished he hadn't. The house no longer felt empty. The scent of fresh bread met him at the door. A fire burned steady, and there were 2 chairs drawn close beside it. She'd made stew again, and this time she sat across from him while they ate. They spoke more than before about Boston's crowded streets, about the wild colts that broke fences every spring. He even found himself laughing once, quietly, at the memory of his sister Martha trying to ride a mule backward on a dare. It startled him, that sound, laughter. It had been years. After supper, he stepped outside. The light was fading. The horizon turning the color of smoke and honey. He felt something in his chest he hadn't felt in years, a kind of peace that scared him more than loneliness ever had. Inside. She hummed a tune he didn't know. He could hear it through the wall, soft and low, and I remember thinking then, this is what danger sounds like, not guns, not storms, but the sound of someone making a home out of your silence. When the third day ended, he told himself it would be her last. She'd done more than enough. The next train would come in the morning, and he'd take her to it. That was the right thing, the safe thing. But as he watched her fold the blanket over the back of the chair, her fingers lingering just a moment on the fabric, he felt that safety slip away. He wasn't afraid of being alone anymore. He was afraid of losing the quiet she'd brought into the house. The sky broke open without warning. One moment. The prairie stretched wide and gold beneath a low sun. The next, The wind came howling from the north, driving clouds like cattle across the range. Ethan Cole had seen enough Montana weather to know trouble when he smelled it. "Storm's rolling in," he said, glancing toward the west. "We'd better head back." Clara Bennett held her hat against the wind, her skirts tugging at her knees. "We won't make it to the house in time." He looked around. The nearest ridge was half a mile off, bare and stony. But beyond the creek bed, he remembered an old line shack, barely more than a frame of wood with a canvas roof. "There," he said, nodding. "We can wait it out." They pushed the horses hard through the rain's first needles. The air turned to steel and the light to pewter. By the time they reached the shack, thunder was crawling over the mountains, and the world had shrunk to sound and shadow. Inside was little more than a cot, a lantern, and a coil of rope. The roof sagged, leaking in slow, deliberate drops. Ethan struck a match, lit the lantern, and the small space filled with a trembling gold glow. He unrolled the oilcloth from his saddlebag and stretched it across one corner to make a kind of tent. "Best we can do," he muttered. Clara didn't answer. Her hair had come loose, damp curls clinging to her neck. She looked smaller, without the hard line of pride she usually carried. When she shivered, he pulled off his coat and held it out. "Take it." "I'm fine," she said automatically. "Don't argue." She hesitated, then slipped it around her shoulders. It dwarfed her, smelled of horse and pine and smoke. They sat for a long time, listening to the rain beat its rhythm on the roof. It wasn't an angry storm, not yet, just steady, like a heartbeat. Ethan fed a few twigs into the small stove and rubbed at the scar along his thumb. The sound of the fire was almost comforting. Clara broke the silence first. "You were right to want me gone," she said quietly. "This land doesn't need another burden." He frowned. "You think that's what you are," she smiled without warmth. 17 cents in a suitcase don't make much of a partner, Mr. Cole." He didn't answer, maybe because there was nothing to argue with, maybe because her voice carried a truth he recognized in himself. People who'd lost so much they no longer believed they had anything left to give. When the thunder moved closer, he reached for the lantern to steady it. The light caught her face, the tiredness, the fine bones, the way her mouth trembled just slightly before she steadied it. And he thought, "I've seen storms, and I've seen pain, but never both in the same pair of eyes." He took a breath. "Clara," he said, her name careful in his mouth. "You could still take that train tomorrow. I wouldn't hold it against you." Her gaze lifted to meet his. "Would you want me to?" The question landed, like rain on dry soil, quiet, unexpected, and deeply alive. He didn't know the answer. Maybe yes, maybe no. All he knew was that her being there, sharing the silence, the cold, the flicker of firelight had changed the air in the house, the shape of his days. It had given him back the sound of another voice at supper, the smell of bread, the reminder that the world could still be gentle. Outside, the storm deepened, the tent canvas snapped, and a cold gust blew out the lantern. In the darkness, he heard her breath uneven, close. He reached to steady the flap, and his hand brushed her shoulder. She flinched, then didn't move. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "It's all right," she whispered. "I'm just not used to anyone meaning well." The rain came harder, and he could barely see her now, just the faint outline when lightning flashed. Then she reached out, finding his hand. For a long moment, they didn't move. The space between them seemed fragile, suspended. He could feel the warmth of her skin, the pulse that matched his own. If the moment had lasted one heartbeat longer, it might have gone too far. But the thunder broke the spell, rolling over the prairie like the voice of something greater than both of them. Ethan let her hand go. She turned away, and neither spoke again that night. By morning, the storm had passed. The world smelled clean and raw, like something reborn. Mist clung to the grass, and the horses stood waiting, their manes slick with rain. Ethan packed the saddle in silence. Clara folded the oilcloth carefully, her face pale in the new light. They didn't speak until they reached the fork where the road split north to the ranch, east to the station. He reined in his horse. "Train leaves at noon," he said. "You'll make it if we ride steady." She nodded. "Thank you, Ethan, for the shelter, for everything." He looked away, toward the horizon. The hills glistened under a weak sun, the kind that promised warmth but didn't yet deliver it. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "You never did." They rode the rest of the way without words. The wind had dried the road by the time the town came into view. The station looked the same as when she'd arrived, empty. Quiet. The rails stretching into distance. The same whistle would call the same way. Ethan dismounted first, took her valise from the wagon bed. "Ticket office'll open soon," he said. She nodded, her gloved hands twisting together. There were no tears this time, just that same calm she'd worn when she first stepped off the train. But now, there was something steadier beneath it. Not pride, not fear, something like acceptance. He set the valise down beside her boots. "You've got a good heart. Clara, don't waste it on the wrong place." She looked up then. Maybe the right place isn't somewhere. Maybe it's someone. The train whistle sounded in the distance. It cut through the morning like a memory of things that couldn't be undone. He took a step back, as if to give her space to choose. His throat felt dry when he finally spoke. "If you leave," he said quietly, "I'll understand." He hesitated, the words rough in his mouth. "But if you stay..." He looked at her fully now, the wind tugging at his coat, his eyes tired but alive. "If you stay, I'll try." The sound of the train grew louder. For a long moment, she stood between the rails and the open sky, her hand resting on the old valise. Then she let it fall. The echo of it hitting the platform was softer than the sigh that left her lips. "I've had enough of leaving," she said. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. That night, back at the ranch, the lamp burned late. The air smelled of rain and cedar, and the world outside was quiet again. I remember that night how the hills still steamed after the storm, how the sky cleared so suddenly it felt like grace, and I remember thinking it wasn't the rain that changed anything. It was the pause after, when two people stood still long enough to listen to their own hearts. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell before Thanksgiving, soft as flour over the grasslands, turning the world into something hushed and waiting. The air smelled of pine and smoke. The creek slowed under thin ice. On mornings, when the wind came down from the north, it carried a sound that could almost be mistaken for music if one still believed in such things. Ethan Cole didn't. Not anymore. He rose before dawn as always, tending the stock, checking the fence lines. The cold bit through his gloves. But he welcomed it. Pain meant motion, and motion meant he didn't have to think. When he came in from the barn, he found Clara already awake, stoking the stove, a wool shawl over her shoulders. The kitchen smelled of coffee and cornmeal. She looked up when he entered. "You'll catch your death out there without breakfast," she said. "Been catching it for years," he muttered, but took the cup she offered. The warmth of it lingered in his hands longer than he wanted to admit. The house had been quiet for so long that even the smallest sound, the scrape of a chair, the steady rhythm of her sewing seemed to fill it with life again. Clara didn't try to change much. She never moved Anna's picture from the mantel, never touched the chest in the corner of the parlor. She dusted them, polished the frames, treated the past as something sacred, not something to erase. When she mended the curtains, she chose fabric that caught the light the same way Anna's had. When she baked, she left an extra plate on the counter, as if for memory's sake. Ethan noticed, though he pretended not to. He watched her from the corner of his eye, saw how she spoke softly to the horses, how she stood outside some evenings, looking at the sky as though it might answer. One night, the wind came hard from the west, shaking the shutters. Ethan built the fire higher, but the draft kept creeping in. Clara was by the window, sewing by lamplight. When she looked up, he saw the shadows beneath her eyes. "You're tired," he said. "So are you," she replied. "I'm used to it." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time you got unused to it." He didn't know what to say to that. The words settled somewhere between them, light as ash, heavy as truth. By Christmas, the snow had deepened. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and the trails had vanished under drifts. For days at a time, they saw no one but each other. Ethan had thought that kind of confinement would suffocate him, but it didn't. It steadied him. The rhythm of her presence became as natural as the creak of the floorboards, the whistle of the kettle. She filled the house with small, human sounds, humming softly as she kneaded dough, laughing once when the cat stole a biscuit off the table. It startled him, that laughter. He hadn't realized how much the house had missed it. One evening, he came in from the barn with a gash on his hand, a piece of wire having cut through his glove. Clara caught his wrist before he could brush it off. "You'll lose that hand if you don't clean it," she said, fetching the basin. "It's nothing. Then you won't mind if I fix it." She washed the wound gently, her fingers cool and sure. The scent of carbolic and lavender filled the air. He watched her in silence, the light playing across her hair. She wasn't beautiful in the way Anna had been. She was something quieter, solid, alive, unafraid of scars. When she tied the bandage, their eyes met. Neither looked away. For a moment, the air in the room seemed to hold its breath. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, "for the way I've been." For she shook her head. "Don't be. We all do what we must to keep breathing." He thought about that long after she'd gone to bed. January came hard. A blizzard buried the valley for 3 days straight. They burned nearly through the woodpile, lived mostly on stew and black coffee. Clara caught a fever one night, and Ethan sat beside her until morning, feeding the fire, dampening her forehead with water. When she woke, weak but smiling, she whispered, "Guess you'll have to keep me now." He almost smiled back. "Guess I will." When the storm finally broke, the world outside glittered like glass. He stepped onto the porch and saw the smoke from their chimney rise straight into the sky, a thin line of life against all that white. And I remember thinking that's what home looks like, not walls or windows, but a column of warmth in the middle of the cold. In the weeks that followed, Clara slowly transformed the house. Not with paint or new furniture, there was no money for that, but with care. She hung sprigs of dried sage near the door, patched the worn quilts, scrubbed the wooden floors until they shone. The kitchen grew warm and orderly. The parlor no longer smelled of dust, but of bread and coffee and something else, something like hope. She never asked for affection, never demanded anything of him, and yet every evening when she handed him his supper, their fingers brushed just long enough for him to remember he wasn't alone. One night, while mending his coat, she said softly, "You don't have to keep looking backward. Ethan." He looked up. "That's where the ones I love are." She nodded. "And where you are is where the ones who still need you might be." He didn't answer, but her words stayed with him, like a lantern left burning long after you've gone to bed. By late February, the snow began to melt. The earth turned dark and wet, and the air smelled faintly of thawing pine. The ranch was still standing. So were they. On the last cold night before spring, he found her sitting by the fire, mending an old tablecloth. He hesitated, then sat across from her. For a long while, they listened to the logs crackle. "Anna used to hum when she sewed," he said quietly. Clara didn't look up. "I know. You told me." He nodded. "I used to think the sound would haunt me forever, but lately, it's your voice I hear in this house." She set the cloth down slowly. "That's not something I tried to do." "I know." He met her eyes. "Maybe that's why it matters." They sat there, the fire painting soft light across the walls. There was no declaration, no reaching across the table, no sudden music, just the kind of silence that feels like forgiveness. Outside, the last snow of winter fell thin, gentle, and brief. I can still see that house when I think back, the small lamp glowing through frost, the smell of coffee at dawn, the warmth that crept in so quietly no one noticed until it filled every room. It was never the grand kind of love people write songs about. It was steadier, humbler a love built with hands that mended instead of demanded. That winter, the coal ranch stopped being just a place to survive. It became a home. By the time the snow melted off the northern hills, the coal ranch had the look of something alive again. Fences stood straight, calves were strong, and the air carried the clean scent of thawed earth. But the thaw brought more than spring. It brought trouble. It started small hoof prints where they shouldn't be, tracks cutting through the lower pasture. Ben Turner, Ethan's oldest hand, found them first. "Could be strays," he said. "Could be Hawkins boys again." Ethan said nothing. He'd dealt with Jed Hawkins before, a man with more land than sense, whose word carried weight in Silver Creek mostly because folks were afraid to cross him. Hawkins' cattle roamed wide, and his temper wider. That week, 3 head went missing, then 5 more. When Ethan rode the South Range and found one of his steers branded over his own mark burned faint beneath Hawkins's H, the quiet he'd worked so hard to keep cracked. Jed Hawkins was at the saloon that night, like he always was when the whiskey was cheap and the talk cheaper. The lamps threw a yellow haze over the room, catching the dust that hung in the air. Ethan pushed through the door, every head turning. Ben followed, silent as a shadow. "Hawkins," Ethan said, his voice low, even, "we need to talk." Hawkins leaned back in his chair, a half-smile under his mustache. "About what? The weather, or those cattle you can't seem to keep penned?" And Ethan's jaw tightened. "You and I both know they didn't walk to your brand by mistake." The saloon went still. Hawkins' son, Luke, a broad-shouldered boy with mean eyes, stood from the far table. You calling my father a thief? Cole, I'm saying what's true. Luke moved first fast, stupid, young. The punch caught Ethan across the jaw, chairs scraped, bottles shattered. Ben stepped in, knocking Luke back with a single swing. But Hawkins' hired men were already rising, guns half drawn. Enough, Ethan barked. He wiped blood from his mouth, glaring at Hawkins. You want a range war fine, but I'll bring the sheriff into it, and I've got proof enough to hang that boy of yours if I have to. Hawkins's smile vanished. Careful what you threaten. Cole, accidents happen in this country. When they walked out into the street, Ethan's ribs ached where a boot had caught him. He spat into the dirt. Should have known better, he muttered. Ben said, You can't reason with a man who thinks the law's just a story to scare children. Ethan nodded. Then maybe it's time someone reminded him it's real. By the next morning, word had spread through Silver Creek that Ethan Cole had picked a fight with the Hawkins clan. Men whispered it over coffee at the Mercantile and by the blacksmith's forge. Some called him brave. Others called him a fool. Clara heard it, too. She was in town buying flour when Mrs. Tully, the storekeeper's wife, said, You tell that man of yours to watch his back. Jed Hawkins don't forget an insult. Clara thanked her, but the words burned all the way home. She'd seen the bruises when Ethan came in that night, pretending he'd fallen from a horse. She'd said nothing then. But now she felt something she hadn't in years' anger. Not the wild kind, but cold, measured, righteous. 2 days later, Ethan rode into town again to meet the sheriff. He didn't tell Clara. When he didn't return by nightfall, she saddled the mare and went after him. The sky was heavy with rain, the kind that smelled like thunder before it came. When she reached the saloon, she could hear raised voices inside. She dismounted, tied the reins tight, and walked through the swinging doors like she'd been born in boots. Hawkins was there, leaning over the bar, glass in hand. Ethan sat at a nearby table, a fresh cut across his cheek, Ben standing behind him. The sheriff, half drunk, half bored, was nowhere to be seen. Well, if it ain't the little wife, Hawkins drawled when he saw her, come to fetch your man before he gets hurt. Clara's heart was pounding, but her voice came steady. I came to finish what he started. The room went quiet. She walked up to the bar, set her gloves down, and faced him squarely. You've been branding cattle that aren't yours, Mr. Hawkins. You know it, and so does everyone else in this room. You can buy the sheriff, but you can't buy Washington law, and I've got a cousin who's clerk to the circuit judge in Helena. You want me to write him a letter. Hawkins's eyes narrowed. You're bluffing. Try me, she said, her tone like iron wrapped in silk. And, while you're thinking on that, consider this if anything happens to Ethan Cole or his ranch. I'll ride to Billings myself and stand before that judge, and I'll make sure your name's the one carved into the record books when they write up who ruined Silver Creek. No one moved. Even Luke Hawkins looked uncertain now, glancing toward his father. Ethan started to rise, but she lifted a hand. Don't. For a long moment, Jed Hawkins just stared at her, jaw working. Then he spat into the spittoon and muttered, You got more gall than good sense. Mrs. Cole, I'm not your Mrs. anything, she said softly. But I've got more sense than to let a bully take what's not his. And then she turned, picked up her gloves, and walked out. When they reached the wagon, Ethan caught her arm. You shouldn't have come, he said. His voice was rough, somewhere between anger and awe. Someone had to. I can fight my own battles." She looked up at him, rain beginning to fall in thin silver lines. "Maybe, but sometimes winning isn't about fighting harder. It's about standing taller." He didn't know what to say. He just stood there, watching as the rain soaked her hair, her dress, her courage. "I'm not a burden, Ethan," she said quietly, "and I don't need saving." He nodded slowly. "No," he said, "you don't." They rode home in silence, the storm behind them and something new between them, something steadier than gratitude, deeper than pride. That night, after the lamps were out, Ethan lay awake listening to the rain on the roof. He thought about the way she'd stood in that saloon, unshaken, the way her voice had filled the room. He realized then that the life he'd been trying to rebuild wasn't meant to be lived alone. I remember thinking it wasn't strength that drew him to her. It was the quiet certainty that she belonged to no one's shadow, not even his. The next morning, the first light broke clean over the valley. Out on the ridge, the cattle grazed under a sky washed clear of storm. For the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt the land breathe easy again. By late spring, the hills around Silver Creek had turned green again. The meadows filled with wild lupine, and the wind carried the smell of thawed soil and sage. Life had steadied on the Cole ranch. The fences held. The cattle grazed easy, and the house had found its rhythm, two people moving around each other with the kind of quiet understanding that doesn't need to be spoken. But peace can be a fragile thing. Sometimes it takes only one familiar voice to stir the dust again. Martha Harper arrived on a Wednesday morning, her buggy rolling up the long dirt road like a piece of the past returning uninvited. Clara saw her first through the kitchen window, a sturdy woman with silver in her hair and a will sharp enough to cut glass. She carried herself like someone who had spent her life holding things together by sheer force of love. When Ethan stepped out onto the porch, he froze. "Martha," he said after a moment, the name caught between surprise and guilt. "Wasn't expecting you." "You never do," she replied, climbing down with the help of the rail. "That's half your problem." He helped her with the trunk, though she didn't need it. Clara came out then, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mrs. Harper, it's good to meet you," she said softly. Martha's eyes studied her, polite but assessing. "So you're the woman who's got my brother feeding 3 meals a day again." Clara blushed. "I cook what needs cooking, ma'am." Martha smiled faintly. "Ma'am, Lord, don't call me that. Makes me sound older than I am. Call me Martha." Ethan looked uneasy, as if a private world had suddenly been cracked open for viewing. "You'll stay the night," he said quickly. "I'll stay as long as I please," she answered, and walked past him into the house. That evening, the three of them sat to supper. The light from the setting sun fell through the window in long bars of gold, catching the steam rising off the stew pot. It should have been a peaceful meal, but Martha had never been one to let silence linger too long. "So," she began, spoon poised, "how long have you two been living like this?" Ethan coughed. "Like what? Like husband and wife without being husband and wife." Clara's hand stilled on the table. The air between them went tight. Ethan stared down at his plate. "It isn't like that," he said finally. Martha arched an eyebrow. "Then tell me what it is." Clara rose to clear the dishes, her face composed but pale. "I'll see to the coffee," she murmured. Martha watched her go, then turned back to her brother. "You think I don't see it?" The way you look at her, the way she steadies you without saying a word. You love her. Ethan, stop living like a ghost." He exhaled sharply. "You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. You've been walking around half alive for 10 years. Anna's gone. God rest her. But you're still here." He stood then, pushing the chair back hard enough to rattle the floorboards. "You think I don't know that you think I haven't tried to make peace with it." His voice broke just slightly, rough with something between anger and sorrow. "She's different, Martha. I can't. It wouldn't be fair to her." "Fair?" Martha's tone softened, but her eyes didn't. "You think love's about fair? It's about truth. And the truth is, that woman's saving you, and you're too stubborn to see it." He turned toward the window, staring out at the fading light. "You should leave this alone." "I can't," she said, "because you're my brother, and I've already buried enough of my family." The words hit like cold water. He didn't answer. The only sound left was the ticking of the clock and the faint clatter of Clara washing dishes in the kitchen. Later, Clara stepped out onto the porch. The evening had cooled, the air thick with the scent of lilac. She stood there, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the horizon where the last of the daylight was bleeding away. Ethan joined her quietly. He looked tired older somehow. The conversation with Martha still clung to him like dust. "She didn't mean to upset you," Clara said after a moment. He gave a short laugh. "Martha's been upsetting me since I was 10. She calls it caring. You should listen to her, though. She's not wrong." He turned to her. "About what? That you're still fighting ghosts," she said softly. "And that, maybe, I remind you too much of what you lost." Her words landed gently, but they carried weight. He started to speak, then stopped. The silence between them filled with the sounds of night crickets, wind, the faint call of an owl. "Finally," he said, "you don't remind me of Anna." Clara looked at him then. "Don't I? Sometimes I wonder if I'm just filling an empty chair." He stepped closer. "You're not her shadow. Clara, you're the reason this house breathes again." She blinked, caught off guard by the honesty in his voice. "Then why won't you?" She stopped, the words catching. "Why won't you let yourself be happy?" He hesitated, searching for the right truth. "Because if I do, it means I've let her go, and I don't know how." For a long time, neither spoke. The wind moved through the cottonwoods, whispering like old memories. Then Clara said, "Letting go doesn't mean forgetting, Ethan. It just means you've made room for the living inside." Martha watched them through the curtain, her expression softening. She knew better than to press further. Some reckonings a man has to make alone. When Clara finally came back in, Martha touched her arm gently. "He's a good man," she said, "just broken in places that don't show." Clara nodded. "Aren't we all?" That night, Ethan sat by the fire long after both women had gone to bed. The coals glowed low, the room half in shadow. He reached for the photograph on the mantel, Anna's face smiling back, frozen in another life. For the first time, he didn't feel only grief. He felt gratitude. He set the picture back and whispered, "Thank you." Then he looked toward the closed bedroom door where Clara slept, and something in his chest eased for the first time in years. I remember that spring as the season when the house stopped echoing. The walls that once held sorrow began to hold laughter, and yet nothing was decided that night. Love on the frontier. seldom came with grand gestures. It came in pauses, and the courage to stay one more day and face the truth together. Silver Creek lay under a pale morning sun, the kind that bleached the edges off everything: rooftops, fences, even hope. Spring had settled on the valley, but there was little peace in it. Folks said Jed Hawkins wasn't done with Ethan Cole. A man like that never was. Rumor traveled faster than wind across those plains. Hawkins had hired a gun out of Billings, a lean drifter called Tate Morrison, known for smiling before he shot. The talk was he'd come to convince Ethan to sell or disappear. Either would suit Hawkins fine. Ethan didn't tell Clara. He fixed the fences, rode the lines, did the chores that needed doing, but the silence around him grew thick, like the air before thunder. He slept with the rifle propped against the bedpost. I remember that week. The ranch itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the cattle moved quieter. Sometimes the land knows before the people do. The trouble came on a Tuesday. Ben Turner rode in fast from town, dust rising behind him like a storm. "They're looking for you," he said, barely out of the saddle. "Hawkins sent his men. Morrison's with them. They're at the Silver Creek Saloon, asking where Cole keeps his money and how much his land's worth dead." Ethan set down his coffee. The calm that came over him wasn't courage. It was something colder, the old kind that comes from having nothing left to lose. "Ben," he said quietly, "saddle my horse." Clara heard them from the porch. When she stepped outside, her apron still damp from washing, the wind lifted her hair like a whisper of warning. "You're going to town," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have to." Ethan replied. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You think this is about land, but it's about pride. Hawkins wants to own you dead or alive. Don't give him the choice." He looked at her then, and she could see the wear in his eyes, the years of grief and grit. "What would you have me do, Hyde? I'd have you live," she said simply. "You said once this ranch wasn't worth dying for. Don't start believing it is." But he'd already turned toward the barn. "That's the thing about men like Ethan Cole. They don't walk into trouble for glory. They walk into it because they can't stomach letting it walk toward someone else." By noon, the town was simmering under heat and rumor. The Silver Creek Saloon stood near the main street, its swinging doors half open, music and menace spilling out in equal measure. Inside, Tate Morrison leaned against the bar, smiling like a man who'd already measured the distance to his grave and found it amusing. Jed Hawkins sat nearby, boots up, whiskey in hand. "Cole'll come." He said to no one in particular. He's too damn stubborn not to. But the man who walked in first wasn't Ethan. It was Clara. She wore a plain blue dress, dust on the hem from the road, and carried no weapon but the calm in her eyes. The room went still the way a field does before lightning strikes. "Well, now," Hawkins drawled, setting down his glass. "Mrs. Cole, ain't it? Or is that still just a rumor?" Clara didn't blink. "Doesn't matter what I'm called. What matters is what I know." Morrison's grin faltered just slightly. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Lady, it means," she said, stepping closer. "I have copies of every cattle registry in this county, every brand sold, every head traded, and the sheriff's been made aware of your forgery, Mr. Hawkins." A low murmur rippled through the room. "You're bluffing," Hawkins said. "Am I?" she asked, tilting her head. "Then why did your man Tate here visit Judge Ellison's office last week to ask about leniency for theft under duress?" The color drained from Hawkins' face. Morrison straightened, his hand hovering near his holster, uncertain. Clara took one more step. If I were you, Mr. Hawkins, I'd leave Silver Creek tonight, while you still can. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then Hawkins stood, jaw tight. "Come on, Tate," he muttered. "Ain't no fight worth losing a ranch over." And just like that, they left the saloon doors swinging in their wake. Clara waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded before she let herself exhale. Her knees felt weak, but she held her ground. Ethan found her not long after, still standing in the middle of the empty saloon. "Ben said you rode into town," he said, his voice rough. "I nearly went mad on the road thinking he stopped himself." She turned to him, half smiling, half trembling. "You're welcome." He stepped closer, searching her face. "You could have been killed. Clara, you don't bluff men like Hawkins." "I wasn't bluffing," she said. "I had the registry books, and if I didn't, I would have found them." He stared at her for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he said, "Why would you risk it?" Her answer came soft, almost like prayer. "Because I was tired of watching you fight alone." Outside, the sky had gone gray, heavy with dust and the smell of distant rain. He looked at her then, not as the woman who had come off the train months ago, frightened and proud, but as someone who had stood between him and the world without a gun in her hand and still won. He took a slow breath. "I don't know what I've done to deserve you," he said. She shook her head. "Deserve's got nothing to do with it." Something in him broke then, not with pain, but release. All the years of holding on to ghosts, all the grief he'd mistaken for loyalty, it all gave way to this single truth standing before him. He reached for her hand, rough fingers against softer ones, and for once, she didn't pull away. The kiss wasn't rushed or hungry. It was the quiet kind, the kind that starts in the eyes before it ever reaches the lips. When it ended, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of every word they'd never needed to say. I remember thinking then, some loves don't begin with thunder. They begin with stillness and a promise made without sound. That night, the lamps burned late at the Cole Ranch. Ethan sat by the window while Clara brewed coffee. Outside, rain began to fall gentle, steady, washing the dust from the earth. He watched her move through the lamplight, the soft rhythm of her steps filling the quiet. And for the first time since he'd buried Anna, he realized he wasn't afraid to live again. The sky above the Silver Creek had turned the color of pewter by late summer, a thin wind sweeping across the hills. Down in the valley, the grass swayed in slow waves, soft and golden. It was the kind of day that felt both empty and full at once, like the earth itself was holding its breath before change. Ethan Cole saddled his horse before dawn. Clara watched from the porch, her shawl pulled tight. Though the morning wasn't cold, she didn't ask where he was going. She already knew. The cottonwood stood on a low hill at the far edge of the property, where the ground sloped toward the creek. Beneath it, shaded and still, were two small markers, one for Anna, his wife, the other for Daniel, their boy. Ethan had carved the names himself years ago, when words were all he had left to offer. He dismounted and stood for a while, the wind combing through the leaves. Then he knelt, brushed the dust from the stones, and set down the bundle of wildflowers Clara had gathered for him. Purple asters and pale sage, the kind Anna used to braid into her hair. He stayed there a long time, his hat in his hands, his shadow falling across the graves. When he finally spoke, His voice was rough but steady. "Anna," he said softly, "you always told me life was for the living. I didn't listen. I kept this place the way it was, every wall, every chair, like you might walk through the door again." The wind stirred, a low whisper through the branches. "I don't reckon you'd know me now. I'm older, slower, meaner. Maybe. But there's someone here who's seen me when I forget to breathe. Someone who looks at this house like it ain't haunted anymore. She's not you, Anna. She never tried to be. And maybe that's what saved me." He paused, his eyes lifting toward the gray sky. "If you can hear me, I just need to know it's all right, that me living again doesn't mean I've stopped loving you." There was no answer, just the cottonwood leaves turning in the wind. But he felt something loosen inside him, like a fist unclenching after years. Maybe forgiveness didn't need words. Maybe it had already been given. He rode back as the sun was setting. The hills glowed in the dim light, and the air smelled of dust and late clover. When he reached the ranch, Clara was waiting at the gate. She didn't speak. She just took the reins and led the horse toward the barn. "How was it?" she asked quietly. He looked at her for a moment before saying, "It was time." They walked to the porch together. The day was fading into that tender kind of twilight that belongs only to Montana, where the sky seems too wide to belong to anyone. Inside, she lit the lamp, the glow soft against her face. "I made stew," she said. "Thought you might be hungry." He smiled faintly. "You always know what I need before I do." She looked down, a blush rising to her cheeks. Not always. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence was thick with things unspoken, the kind that hums in the space between two people who've both been too careful for too long. Later, when the rain began to fall quiet, summer rain that pattered soft against the roof, Ethan found her standing by the window, watching the sky. Her hair was loose, her dress pale in the lamplight. He stepped closer, close enough to smell the faint scent of soap and cedar. "It's a good rain," he murmured. "It is," she said, turning slightly. Her eyes met his, calm and unafraid. "The earth needs it. So do we," he said, his voice almost a whisper. She didn't step back. Neither did he. He reached for her hand, rough, calloused fingers finding hers. The warmth of her skin startled him. It had been so long since he'd let himself reach out for something living. She didn't pull away, she just looked up, and in her eyes he saw no pity, only quiet knowing. "Ethan," she said softly, "you don't have to be sorry anymore." He swallowed hard. "I don't know how not to be." "Then let me show you. I won't tell you every detail of that night. Some memories belong to the hush of firelight and the sound of rain. But I remember the way the lamp flickered when the wind changed, and the way she touched his face as though she were learning a language she already knew. There was no desperation in it, no breaking of vows, only the slow, sacred recognition of two lives finding their way toward the same light. When the storm passed and the silence settled, Ethan lay awake, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing beside him. Outside, the cottonwoods swayed gently under the clearing sky, and for the first time in years, the house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like it was breathing again with them. At dawn, the rain had stopped, mist clung to the valley, and the world smelled new. Clara woke to find him already dressed, standing by the window. The light touched his face gently, and something in him had changed. The hardness was gone. He turned when he felt her stir. "I went up there yesterday," he said. "I know." she whispered. I told her about you. Clara sat up, the blanket around her shoulders, and what did she say? He smiled faintly, didn't say a word, but I reckon she gave me her blessing. Clara's eyes filled, though she didn't cry. She reached for his hand, and he took it, holding it as though it were something sacred. Clara, he said quietly, I don't have much to offer, no fine house, no money to speak of, but I've got this land, this life. If you'd have me, I'd like to make it yours too. Her breath caught, soft as a prayer. Are you asking me, Ethan? He nodded once. I am. She smiled through the tears she didn't let fall. Then I reckon you got yourself an answer. They married a week later, under that same cottonwood. The hill was warm with sunlight, the creek running full from the rain. Ben Turner stood as witness. Martha sent a Bible wrapped in cloth and a note that simply read, About time. Clara wore no veil, just wildflowers in her hair. Ethan looked at her like a man seeing the world for the first time. When the preacher asked if he took her hand in this life and the next, he said, I already have. And for once, there was no shadow behind his words. I can still see them now. If I close my eyes, the cottonwood above, its leaves whispering like old friends, and the wind carrying their laughter down to the creek. Some folks say love is thunder and lightning, but I've come to believe it's more like rain, quiet, patient, and enough to make even the hardest ground bloom again. By December of 1875, winter had claimed Silver Creek. The world was white and still, the air so cold that sound itself seemed to freeze before it could travel. The cottonwoods stood bare along the creek bed, their limbs etched against a pale sky. Smoke curled steady from the chimney at Cole Ranch, a thin thread of warmth in a land made for endurance. Inside, Clara Bennett moved slowly, her hands resting on the curve of her belly as she stirred the pot on the stove. The baby had begun to kick now and then, gentle reminders that life, even here, insisted on continuing. She smiled at the thought, though she'd never say aloud how much the idea of motherhood frightened her. Some nights, lying awake beside Ethan, she could hear the wind pushing against the windows, and she would think of all the ways the world could break a heart. But then she'd feel his hand find hers in the dark rough, certain, wordless, and the fear would fade like frost under sunlight. The wedding was set for the first Saturday of winter. Ethan said they didn't need ceremony, life itself was enough promise. But Clara wanted something small, something that marked the difference between surviving and living. Just a few words, she told him, so that when the baby asks someday, we'll have something to tell. He'd smiled at that, a rare kind of smile, quiet and without defense. All right, he'd said. A few words. Martha Harper arrived the day before, bundled in wool and carrying more food than 4 people could eat in a week. You think I'd let my brother get married without a decent pie, she said, hugging Clara tight. Ben Turner came that night, too, brushing snow from his coat, a grin under his mustache. Never thought I'd live to see Ethan Cole wearing a clean shirt, he said. Don't get used to it, Ethan replied. The laughter that followed was soft and easy, the kind that belongs only to people who've worked hard for peace. They were married in the parlor, under the same beam that Ethan had mended the spring before. The preacher from town couldn't make it through the snow, so Martha read the vows from her worn Bible, her voice trembling once, though she'd never admit it. Ethan wore his best coat, the one with the missing button. Clara wore a simple blue dress and her hair loose, tied with a white ribbon Martha had sewn into the hem. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled the room. Outside, snow drifted quietly against the windows. "Do you, Ethan Cole, take this woman to share your days?" Martha read. "I do," he said. "And do you, Clara Bennett, take this man to walk beside you, through whatever seasons come?" Clara's eyes shone. "I do." Ben cleared his throat, looking away as Martha closed the Bible. "Well," he said, "that's about the finest sermon I ever heard." Everyone laughed then, even Ethan. It was the first time in years his laughter sounded unbroken. Afterward, they ate by the fire stew, bread, and the apple pie Martha insisted on. Snow piled higher outside, and the wind whistled under the eaves, but inside the house there was light, warmth, and something else, a kind of still joy that didn't need naming. Later, when Ben and Martha had gone to the bunkhouse to sleep, Ethan and Clara sat alone by the hearth. The lamp burned low. The baby kicked once, and she took his hand, placing it gently against her stomach. He looked at her, wonder softening the lines of his face. "You sure it's not just that pie?" She smiled, eyes glistening. "Pretty sure." He didn't speak again for a while. He just watched the firelight play across her features, the gentleness there, the strength. Then, in that low, unhurried voice she'd come to love, he said, "I never thought I'd get another chance at a life like this." Clara turned toward him. "You didn't get another chance, Ethan. You made one." Outside, the storm thickened. Snow fell in slow, heavy flakes, blanketing the valley in silence. The Cole ranch sat like a lantern in a sea of white, the windows glowing against the dark. Inside, the warmth held steady a small defiance against the world's coldness. I remember that night. The wind rose and fell, the kind that shakes doors loose if they aren't latched right. But the light from that house never flickered. It burned all through till morning. The first time since Anna and Daniel passed that the lamp stayed lit through the night. By morning, Silver Creek was buried in snow. The fence lines were gone. The road to town vanished. But the world felt new, clean. Ethan stepped outside, pulling his coat close, and looked toward the hills where the cottonwoods stood, that quiet sentinel over everything that had been lost and found. He thought of Anna then, but the memory didn't hurt any more. It just existed, like the snow or the sky part of the landscape of who he was. When he came back in, Clara was by the stove, humming a tune he didn't know. Her hair caught the light, and for a second, the whole room seemed to glow around her. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just how lucky a fool can get," he said. She laughed, shaking her head. "Don't go saying that. You'll make the Lord reconsider." That evening, as twilight spread across the valley, Ethan lit the lamp again. It burned brighter than usual, its light reaching every corner of the house. Clara watched it for a long moment. "Why leave it on?" she asked. He looked at her, then at the baby cradle waiting by the wall. "Because there's life in this house now. Feels wrong to let it go dark?" She smiled, and for a moment, the two of them just stood there listening to the wind, to the silence, to the heartbeat of something larger than themselves. I think about that light sometimes, how it burned through the longest night of that winter, casting its glow out across the frozen fields. It wasn't just a lamp. It was a promise that love, when tended, can outlast even the coldest season. Spring came slow to Silver Creek that year. The snow lingered in the shadows of the cottonwoods, and the creek ran high with meltwater, singing its rough, cold song. The air still held a bite in it, but the light was changing softer, longer, the kind that made a man believe winter really could end. Inside the house on Cole Ranch, life was already stirring. Clara moved slower now, her steps measured, her hands often resting on the swell of her belly. The baby was due any day, and though she smiled often, there was a tiredness behind her eyes, the kind only a woman carries when she's walking the line between fear and faith. Ethan tried not to show his worry, but it hung around him like the smell of smoke after a fire. He fixed fences that didn't need fixing, mended saddles already sound, split more firewood than the stove could burn, anything to keep his hands busy because idle hands left room for memory, and memory, for Ethan Cole, was a dangerous thing. He still remembered the night Anna had died, the way the doctor wouldn't meet his eyes. The stillness of the house, the sound of the wind against the window pane. She'd been carrying their second child. Fever came first. Then silence. It had broken something in him that he never thought could mend. Now, watching Clara move about their home, her laughter soft, her faith unshaken, he felt that old fear rise again like a storm building on the horizon. Martha had come to stay, just in case. Ben Turner rode in every morning to check the stock and stayed close enough to fetch the doctor if needed. They didn't speak of what could go wrong, but the thought lingered in every corner of the room. The labor began on a Thursday, just before dawn. The wind had turned warm overnight, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. Clara woke with a start, gripping the sheets, a sound escaping her lips that pulled Ethan from his sleep like a shot. "It's time," she whispered. He sat up, heart hammering. "Now." She nodded, breath catching as another pain came. Martha was already at the door, calm and commanding. "Get water boiling. Ethan, towels. Lots of 'em. And send Ben for Doc Myers." He did as she said, though his hand shook so bad he spilled half the bucket before reaching the stove. Every sound in the house seemed magnified, the fire crackling, the kettle hissing, the wind pressing at the shutters. Time moved strange during those hours, too fast and too slow all at once. From the other room came Clara's cries, raw and real, and each one felt like a nail driven into his chest. At one point, he found himself outside, leaning against the porch post, gasping air that wouldn't stay in his lungs. The memory of Anna's last breath came back like a ghost he couldn't banish. He wanted to pray, but couldn't find the words. All he could manage was, "Please, not again." Then, through the open window, he heard Martha's voice, firm and steady, and Clara's, breaking and brave, and something in him steadied. He went back inside. Hours passed. The sun climbed high, then began to fall again. When the cry finally came, it was small but fierce, the kind that sounded more like a protest than a plea. Ethan froze, listening. Then Martha appeared at the doorway, her face wet with tears and sweat. "You've got yourself a son," she said, voice cracking, "and Clara's fine. Tired, but fine." For a moment, Ethan couldn't move. His mind didn't believe what his heart already knew. Then he stumbled toward the bedroom like a man finding his way through a dream. Clara lay pale but smiling, her hair damp, her eyes bright with exhaustion and relief. In her arms, wrapped in a quilt, was something impossibly small, a bundle of warmth and breath and newness. Ethan stopped at the foot of the bed, afraid to come closer. "He's perfect," she whispered, "and stubborn, like his father." He knelt beside her, his hand trembling as he touched the baby's head, soft. Fine hair, the color of wheat. The child stirred, made a small sound, and in that moment, everything that had ever been broken in Ethan began to knit back together. "What'll we call him?" he asked softly. Clara's smile deepened. "Henry Cole." He nodded, tasting the name like something sacred. "Henry," he said again, and the baby's eyes fluttered open, the faintest blue. I swear the air changed then warmer, lighter, the way it does when the sun breaks through after days of rain. That night, when the others had gone to rest, Ethan sat alone by the fire with his son in his arms. The baby slept, small chest rising and falling, his hand curled tight around one of Ethan's fingers. Outside, frogs had begun their slow chorus by the creek. Spring had truly come. Ethan looked down at Henry, at this quiet miracle that carried both past and future in his tiny frame. For years, he'd believed he was living in the shadow of death, walking through life as if apology could substitute for purpose. But here, in this warm, dim room, he understood what living really meant. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about forgiving himself most of all. He bent his head, pressed his lips to the baby's hair, and whispered, "You'll never know the kind of man I was before. Only the one I'm trying to be now." Clara stirred, opening her eyes. "You're still awake," she murmured. "Didn't want to miss this," he said. "Feels like the first night of the rest of my life." She smiled faintly. "It is." He looked toward the window. Outside, the moon hung low, its light spilling over the snowmelt and turning the world silver. The lamp still burned on the table steady, unwavering, just as it had through the winter. For the first time, Ethan realized that he didn't dread the dawn anymore. He wanted to see it. I think of that night, sometimes the sound of the fire, the soft breathing of mother and child, the way Ethan sat there long after the lamp burned low. He wasn't a man haunted anymore. He was a father, holding proof that love can come back from the grave if you're brave enough to wait for spring. And in that quiet house, under the vast Montana sky, life began again gently, steadily, as all good things do. By the summer of 1876, Silver Creek was no longer a dot on the map. A new line of track ran east toward Red River Junction, and the distant whistle of trains echoed through the hills like the promise of a different century. Cattle grazed fat and steady across the plains, and on the ridge above it all stood the Cole Ranch, its fences mended, its barns full, its windows bright with evening light. Ethan Cole was 40 now, and the lines on his face had deepened into something permanent, not sorrow, exactly, but the kind of gravity men earn from weather and years. Clara said it made him look wise. He told her it only made him look slow. Their boy Henry had turned one that spring, a restless bundle of legs and laughter who insisted on following his father wherever he went. Clara would stand in the doorway, hands on her hips, watching the two of them wander out to the corrals together, the man once broken by loss, and the child who'd given him back his future. It was Clara, not Ethan, who saw what needed to come next. Prices had fallen, buyers from the Eastern Syndicate squeezing every rancher for miles. Jed Hawkins' death the winter before had left his land in dispute, and the smaller outfits were being picked off, one by one. "You can't fight men with ledgers by drawing guns," she said one evening, spreading a map across the kitchen table, "but you can make them need you." Ethan looked down at the map lines of river and trail marked in her neat handwriting. "What are you thinking, Clara?" "I'm thinking we stop working alone. form something in association. The Silver Creek Cattlemen's Association. Pool our stock, drive together, bargain together. If they want beef from this valley, they'll deal fair." He studied her for a moment, the firelight catching the curve of her cheek. "You talk like a politician." She smiled. "No, Ethan Cole. I talk like a wife who doesn't want to see you run yourself to dust while others profit from it." By autumn, they had gathered 12 ranchers and the schoolhouse men who had once argued over water rights, now sitting shoulder to shoulder on rough benches. Ben Turner called the meeting to order, clearing his throat loud enough to startle the lamps. Clara stood beside the chalkboard, speaking steady and plain. She didn't raise her voice, didn't appeal to pride. She spoke instead about fairness, about legacy, about what their children would inherit if they built something stronger than fences. When she finished, the room was quiet. Then old Pete Morin from the North Ranch said, "Well, I'll be damned if she ain't right." Laughter broke, slow and easy. The vote was unanimous, and that's how it began. The first joint cattle drive to Red River Junction was a test of more than skill. They faced rustlers along the bluffs, swollen rivers, and nights so cold the horses shivered under double blankets. But they also found something rarer trust. Clara rode with them the first few days. Henry left in Martha's care, her hat pulled low against the wind. The men tried to talk her into turning back, but she only smiled. "A woman's place is wherever her word's been given," she said, and no one argued again. When they reached the junction, Eastern buyers waited with their clipped accents and fancy boots. They expected the usual desperate men undercutting one another. Instead, they found a line of ranchers standing shoulder to shoulder and Clara Cole at the front, ledger in hand. "Our cattle," she said, "our price, take it or leave it." They took it. That night, under a sky thick with stars, Ethan sat by the fire watching the herd settle. The deal they'd made would feed every family through winter and then some. The rustlers had been caught and turned over to the law. The Hawkins spread, left untended after Jed's passing, was already being fenced for new grazing land. Ben Turner poured 2 cups of coffee, handed one over. "Never thought I'd see the day we outsmarted the whole territory," he said. Ethan chuckled. "Don't give me the credit. This was Clara's doing." Ben grinned. "Figures. The women always fix what we break." Back home, Clara waited on the porch, Henry asleep in her arms. When Ethan rode in, she didn't ask about money or contracts. She only said, "Did it work?" He nodded. "Better than we hoped. They'll pay fair from now on." She smiled, eyes soft with pride. "Then we've built something that might just last." From 1876 to 1878, Silver Creek changed faster than anyone could have dreamed. The telegraph came through first, then the stage line. Storefronts rose where once there'd been only dust. The ranchers who'd nearly gone under found themselves stable again, some even thriving. And through it all, the Cole Ranch stood at the heart of it, not the biggest, not the richest, but the one others looked to when storms came. Ethan would still ride out before dawn, checking fences and counting head. But he carried himself differently now, not like a man guarding a graveyard, but like one planting roots for generations yet to come. Sometimes I wonder if he ever realized how much of that came from Clara, who saw further than any of them, who believed in building rather than fighting. Maybe he did. Maybe that's why, on quiet evenings, he'd sit beside her by the fire and say, "You're the smartest rancher in Silver Creek." And she'd answer, "I just have better handwriting." In the fall of '78, the association gathered again, this time at the Cole Ranch. They dedicated a new corral built from timber hauled down the valley. A sign hung above it, carved by Ethan himself. "For those who work honest and stand together." Martha cried when she saw it. Ben pretended not to. Ethan gave a speech short, plain, the way frontier men spoke when their hearts were too full for ornament. He talked about neighbors, about second chances, about the way a community could grow stronger than any one man's will. Then he looked toward Clara, who stood at the edge of the crowd with Henry on her hip, and said quietly, "None of this happens without her." The wind shifted then, catching the flag above the barn, and for a moment everyone just listened to the horses stamping, the creek running, the faint whistle of a train far away. It felt, somehow, like a prayer answered. I was there that day, standing by the fence with the others. I remember thinking that the world doesn't mark its miracles with trumpets or halos. Sometimes it's just a woman's idea, a man's humility to follow it, and the courage of simple folk choosing decency over division. That's how Silver Creek survived. That's how the Cole Ranch became more than land. It became a promise. By 1879, Silver Creek no longer slept beneath silence. The sound of the railroad had become its heartbeat, the whistle of the northbound train rising through the valley twice a day, carrying letters, lumber, and the future. Where once the Cole Ranch had been a lone outpost against the wind, it now stood at the center of a small, thriving settlement. From the porch, Clara Cole could watch smoke from a dozen chimneys drifting across the plain. It wasn't the wilderness anymore, but it still smelled of sage and freedom. Ethan sat beside her, mending a halter. He was slower now, shoulders broader, hands scarred by seasons and work. When the wind shifted, she could hear the children Henry chasing the chickens again, Rosie laughing somewhere near the well. "They sound like the world's already theirs," she said. He looked up, smiling faintly. "Maybe it is." Those were years of quiet plenty. After the success of the Cattlemen's Association, the ranch had grown Peterson's land first, then Barton's, and finally Hendrick's meadow down by the creek. Each purchase was made not for pride, but for stability, a patchwork stitched from trust and handshake deals. By the early 1880s, the Cole Ranch stretched far beyond what Ethan had ever dreamed, though he still rose before dawn, saddling his horse with the same steady motions he'd learned 20 years before. He said it kept him honest, the work, the rhythm, the sound of hooves against frozen ground. Clara managed the accounts now, her handwriting as precise as ever. But more than that, she managed the spirit of the place, keeping the meals hot, the doors open, the men paid on time, the children scrubbed and kissed and sent to bed with stories of kindness, not conquest. She believed in making the land good not by owning it, but by caring for it. Ethan used to tease her about that, but deep down he knew she was right. Henry grew like the valley itself, wild, curious, steady as sunlight. At 7, he could already ride bareback across the field. At 8, he asked questions about everything from barbed wire to heaven. Rosie came after, red-haired and stubborn, with her mother's quiet eyes and her father's grit. Then Noah, born too soon, one stormy night, so small Ethan could cradle him in one hand. For days they feared he wouldn't last. Clara sat by the cradle without sleeping, humming low tunes she remembered from Boston. Ethan prayed for the first time in years, words rough and half forgotten. But the boy lived. By spring, Noah was crawling, laughing proof that sometimes grace comes quiet, without thunder. Then, in 81 came the last Margaret Eliza, dark-haired, born in peace. Clara said it was fitting for children, one for every season the ranch had seen them through. In those days, Martha Harper still came often. She'd remarried a kind widower in Billings, a newspaper man named Samuel Price, and though her letters spoke of city comforts, she always said Silver Creek felt more like home. When she visited, the children would swarm her like sparrows. She'd bake pies, scold Ethan for overworking, and sit with Clara long after the lamps were dim, talking of how far they'd all come. But time, as it does, kept its own quiet count. In the winter of 82, word came that Martha had taken ill. Clara rode the train to Billings with Ethan, snow blurring the window glass like memory itself. They arrived too late to see her wake, but her husband placed a folded letter in Clara's hands. It was short, written in Martha's steady script. Tell Ethan he was right to try again. Tell him love was never meant to end with one lifetime, and tell Clara thank you for saving my brother when no one else could. Ethan read it twice, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. He never spoke of it again. But sometimes Clara would find him on the porch at dusk, turning the letter over in his hands like a prayer worn smooth. The spring after Martha's passing was the gentlest in memory. The snow melted early, the river ran clear, and the hillsides turned green so quickly it almost seemed like the earth was hurrying to make something beautiful before grief caught up. Ethan threw himself into work, rebuilding fences, expanding the barns. He said the children needed to see him strong. But Clara understood he was trying to keep sorrow at a distance. One evening, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in copper and rose, she said softly, "You know, I think she'd be proud of you." He didn't answer right away. His eyes followed a hawk circling high above the fields. "I hope so," he said finally. "She was the first one to push me toward living again. I just took too long to listen. By autumn, Silver Creek had changed beyond recognition. There was a depot now, a telegraph office, a small schoolhouse where Rosie and Henry learned their letters. The ranchers who had once struggled now rode fine horses and sent their sons east for education. But at the Cole Ranch, life stayed simple. Evenings were for gathering by the fire, Clara mending clothes, Ethan carving toys. The children sprawled on the floor. When the wind rose, the lamp would flicker, and the warmth inside seemed to grow in defiance of the cold beyond the walls. I remember those nights, the way the house glowed like it was lit from the inside out, the laughter that came easily, the pauses that didn't need filling. That's the thing about peace when you finally find it. You stop needing to talk it into being. Years later, people in the valley would call that stretch of time the golden years when everything flourished and the Coles' kindness set the tone for the town that grew around them. But to Ethan and Clara, it wasn't gold at all. It was ordinary days, muddy boots by the door, soup simmering on the stove, a child's laughter echoing through the hall. That was the miracle. That was the legacy. By the mid-1880s, Montana was no longer the edge of the world. The railroad had carved its silver line through the plains, and men in pressed coats from New York and Chicago arrived with contracts thicker than any Bible. They came speaking of progress and efficiency, of consolidation and growth, but what they meant was ownership of land, of cattle, of people's quiet labor. They made their offers to every ranch in Silver Creek. Most were polite, some weren't. When they came to the coal ranch, Ethan listened in silence, his hands folded on the table, the light from the fire turning his hair to copper. When the man in the suit finished his speech, Ethan stood, walked to the door, and held it open. "You boys can buy a lot of things out here," he said, voice steady, "but not a man's life. And that's what this land is ours." The men left. They didn't understand that he wasn't angry. He was finished. The next morning, word spread fast. Clara called a meeting of the Cattlemen's Association in the old schoolhouse. It had been nearly a decade since they'd formed it. Now it stood not as a hope, but as a heritage. Ben Turner presided, older and stouter, but still quick with a joke. Pete Morin came down from the north pasture. Henry, now a tall boy of 10, sat in the back row, watching his mother address a room full of men twice her age. "They'll pick us off one by one if we let them," she said, voice clear and calm. "But if we stand together, if we refuse to sell, they can't touch us. They'll move on to easier ground." Ethan said little. He just sat beside her, hat in his hands, watching the light move across her face. He'd once thought the strength was measured by how much a man could endure, but he'd learned it was measured by who you stood beside when the storm came. When the vote was called, it was unanimous. Silver Creek would stay free. Later that week, Ethan took Henry up to the hill behind the ranch, the one with the cottonwood tree. It was spring again, the air soft and heavy with thawing earth. Below them, the fields stretched golden and green, dotted with cattle like slow-moving clouds. They stopped at the small fence that marked the resting place of Anna and Daniel. Henry had been here before, but he'd never asked much about them. Now, at 10, questions came easy. "Were they your first family?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "They were, a long time ago." Henry looked down, thinking it over. "Do you miss them every day?" Ethan said quietly. "But missing doesn't mean I wish things were different. It just means they mattered." The boy was quiet a while. Then he said, "So, how can you love Mama and still love them too?" Ethan smiled that slow, thoughtful smile that always started in his eyes. "Love doesn't divide, son. It multiplies. That's the secret no one tells you. When you give it away, you don't lose any, it grows." He looked at the graves again, then at the valley below, the ranch, the house, the life built from second chances. "That's what your mama taught me," he said softly. "How to live again, not just keep breathing." That evening, the house filled with the kind of warmth that doesn't come from fire alone. Rosie, now 8, was reading aloud from a worn book of poems. Noah, younger and restless, played with a carved wooden horse at her feet. Margaret, still a baby, slept in Clara's arms. The lamp flickered, and for a moment Ethan thought of all the nights that had come before the storms, the laughter, the silences, the beginnings and endings that had brought them here. He glanced across the room to Clara, her face softened by the lamplight. She caught his gaze, smiled, and mouthed something only he could read. "You okay?" He nodded. More than okay. A week later, Clara's cousin arrived from Boston, a young woman named Eloise, all lace and astonishment. She'd written for years, but never visited, and now, stepping off the train at Silver Creek, she looked as if she'd landed on another planet. When she reached the ranch, she stared at the broad fields, the barn, the wide Montana sky, and finally at Clara, her cousin who had once lived in the same city boarding house, who now carried herself with the quiet authority of a frontier matriarch. "My goodness," Eloise whispered. "How did you ever learn to live like this?" Clara smiled. "You don't learn. You listen. The land teaches you. Inside." She met Ethan, polite, reserved, a touch wary of city manners. Eloise watched the way he looked at Clara, steady, devoted, no show in it, and later told her cousin, "He loves you as if the world ended and began with you." Clara just laughed softly. Maybe it did, that night, as the children slept and the house fell quiet. Ethan and Clara sat by the fire. The wind had picked up outside, whispering through the cottonwoods. A train sounded in the distance, not an intrusion now, but a rhythm of life itself. Ethan stirred the coals, watching the sparks drift upward. "You know," he said after a long pause, "I was thinking about that day in Silver Creek, when you stepped off the train. I thought sending you away was the sensible thing, that I was doing you a favor." Clara smiled faintly, eyes on the fire, and he turned to her, his voice low, honest. "Best mistake I ever made." She didn't answer, just reached over and took his hand the same way she had years ago, in a tent during a rainstorm when neither of them knew how much they still had left to live for. Outside, the wind shifted, the cottonwoods rustled. Somewhere, an owl called. Inside, the lamp burned warm and steady, just as it had every night since the winter they first said "I do." I sometimes think of them still, of that ranch, that valley, that family who chose to love the world as it was and make it gentler. The East forgot them, of course. Progress moved on, rails stretching farther west. But in Silver Creek, people remembered. They said Ethan and Clara Cole taught them something important, that love isn't a miracle. It's a decision. And sometimes the best things in life begin when you're brave enough to make the wrong one. Thank you for riding alongside Ethan and Clara Cole through loss, forgiveness, and the quiet rebirth of love on the edge of the American frontier. If you're still here as the music fades, maybe it's because you know this truth too. Real love doesn't need perfection. It just asks that we keep our hearts open even after they've been broken. Their story isn't only about the past. It's about all of us, anyone who's ever lost something they thought they couldn't live without, and somehow found life again in the ashes. Because sometimes the best lives begin when our plans fall apart. Ethan thought he was finished. But then came Clara, proof that love doesn't divide what came before. It multiplies. It grows in memory, in family, in every sunrise and shared silence. It's not about forgetting what was lost. It's about learning to love again without fear. So, if their story touched you, even just a little, I invite you to let it live on. Leave a like, share it with someone who needs hope tonight, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of grace, courage, and rebirth beneath the wide western sky. Thank you for listening, and may the light in your own home, like the one that burned all night at the Cole Ranch, never fade, no matter how long the winter lasts.